Good morning. I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Savannah Sellers. Right now on Morning News Now, under investigation, the Justice Department has launched a probe into the Minneapolis Police Department over whether the department's practices violate the Constitution or federal civil rights laws. We'll bring you the latest on the aftermath of the Chauvin conviction as Minneapolis lays 20-year-old Daunte Wright to rest. Another look. Columbus, Ohio police have released more body camera footage of the shooting death of 16-year-old Ma'khia Bryant. The added context this video provides to this tragedy, response from the city officials, and the latest on the investigation. Sweetening the deal. President Biden is now touting yet another vaccine milestone for the U.S. as his first 100 days comes to a close.
Today, we hit 200 million shots. And the 92nd day in office. It's an incredible achievement for the nation.
Now the administration's focus turns to vaccinating the general population instead of just those at high risk. The new incentive being rolled out to small businesses aimed at getting workers their shot. And Mother Nature chic. On this Earth Day, we'll introduce you to a woman named Maya Penn, an ardent environmental activist with a passion for sustainable fashion. We'll chat with this 21-year-old CEO on how to keep fighting climate change in vogue. Joe, happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day. I have to remember, it's been around since 1970, but it's as important as ever right now.
It certainly is, and it's good to have it in the mainstream conversation quite a bit. I think we both wore blue for Earth Day. Look at us kind of matching. I know. Not planned, but we're just so in sync these days. We'll get to that great story later in the hour, but we begin in Minneapolis, where the city's police department faces national scrutiny and the focus on police reform sharpens.
This morning, as that Justice Department investigation begins, former officer Derek Chauvin sits in a maximum security prison outside Minneapolis, awaiting his sentencing. He was convicted just 2 days ago of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. Meanwhile, mourners are gathering in Minneapolis today for the funeral of Daunte Wright. He was shot and killed by police last week in nearby Brooklyn Center. For more on all this, let's bring in NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster joining us from Minneapolis. So, Shaq, as we mentioned, the Justice Department has launched an investigation into the practices of the Minneapolis Police Department. Why is the DOJ doing this, and what will federal officials focus on?
Well, we heard from the Attorney General of the United States yesterday, who said that the verdict in the Chauvin trial does not address the potentially systemic issues with the Minneapolis Police Department. So the Department of Justice is launching this patterns and practice investigation, looking into whether or not the Minneapolis Police Department has a pattern of discriminatory policies, if they have a pattern of use of excessive force. They're also looking at their response and their use of force involving First Amendment activities, those protests that we saw in the wake of George Floyd's death. Listen to a little bit of what we heard from the Attorney General, Merrick Garland.
Strongly believe that good officers do not want to work in systems that allow bad practices. Good officers welcome accountability because accountability is an essential part of building trust with the community, and public safety requires public trust.
Now, this move was actually welcomed by many local leaders. Not only did you have it welcomed by and embraced by the city council, but you also heard from the police chief, who said he will comply and he will participate in this investigation.
And Shaq, corrections officials there in Minnesota say Derek Chauvin is currently being held away from other inmates in a segregated housing unit. What can you tell us about that prison and what's next for Chauvin?
That's right. He's in the state's most secure prison and in the most secure unit of that prison. He is isolated from other inmates, not having regular contact. He's being monitored at least once every 30 minutes. His meals are delivered to his cell. He's only allowed to leave that cell about 1 hour every day. So those are the conditions he'll be facing for at least the next few years. And we also know that if you look at what Minneapolis residents are looking ahead to, this is not the only trial that they're facing. They're also looking ahead to the trial of the 3 other officers involved in George Floyd's death. That is expected to come sometime in August.
And Shaq, before we let you go, you're standing outside of Shiloh Temple there, so I want to ask you about today's funeral service for Daunte Wright. What can we expect? Who's going to be speaking?
Daunte Wright, again, the 20-year-old who was killed in Brooklyn Center, sparked days of protests as the Chauvin trial was going on. We know that the officer said you intended to use, or the department has said that the officer planned to use her taser, and instead he fired her gun, killing 20-year-old Daunte Wright. Well, visitation was yesterday. We saw a public visitation where members of the public came in. Today we'll expect to hear from Reverend Sharpton. We'll hear a call to action from family attorney Benjamin Crump. Listen to a little bit of what we heard from Reverend Sharpton yesterday, which gives a hint at what we can expect here during his official eulogy today.
As we got the verdict last night for George Floyd, and people celebrated all over the country, as I was crying, the thing that bothered me was right down the road was Daunte Wright. Minnesota doesn't have the right to talk about what it did right until they get this right.
Now, we also expect to hear from some Minnesota political leaders. Amy Klobuchar is slated to speak. And then, of course, we'll hear from his family, his mom, his dad, some of his siblings. He has 6 siblings, 3 brothers and 3 sisters. So we can expect a pretty emotional day once services begin at noon local time.
All right, Jack, thank you so much.
Protesters gathered for a second night in Columbus, Ohio, after police released new body cam footage of the shooting death of 16-year-old Ma'khia Bryant. And we want to warn you, what you're about to see is disturbing. In this body cam video shot and blurred by Columbus police, officers are responding to a disturbance call on Tuesday afternoon. As an altercation unfolds, the officer shouts to get down and fires his weapon a few seconds later. After Bryant is on the ground, an officer can be heard saying, quote, "She had a knife. She just went at her." NBC News Now correspondent Maura Barrett is in Columbus for us this morning. Maura, good morning. Now, take us through what we're learning from this new body camera footage, what we can see was happening there, and also what authorities are saying about the shooting and this use of force in this case.
Good morning, Savannah. In addition to those body cam videos that we saw yesterday afternoon, they also released the 911 calls involved in the incident. You hear the caller on the other end of the 911 call say the urge for police to come as soon as possible because grown girls are trying to stab them. Now, it's unclear who exactly was making the calls, but now the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigations has taken up the case. The Columbus public safety officer urging the community for peace.
We have to ask ourselves, what information did the officer have? What did he see? How much time did he have to assess the situation? And what would have happened if he had taken no action at all? We don't yet have those answers. So I plead with the community, let us not rush to judgment. As I said last night, fast facts should not come at the cost of complete and accurate facts.
Last evening and overnight, there were several demonstrations here in the city, over at the State House and on the campus of Ohio State University. The community members largely staying peaceful as they chanted in remembrance of Mikaya and held up signs for police reform.
Now, Maura, let's pick it up right there with what the public safety director was saying, pleading with the community to not rush to judgment. So how is the community responding? What have protests like? And also, what about Makaya's family? Have they said anything about her death or those events that are in question leading up to the shooting?
These demonstrations have largely been peaceful each night so far, Savannah. A lot of marches happening around the city, but not any majorly large crowds that we've seen. As for her friends and family, they're expressing heartache. Her aunt, Hazel Bryant, speaking out, saying that her niece was defending herself because the girls, or the women she referred to, were fighting with her. And so she says that she's very angry. We're also hearing from one of Makaya's teachers who said that she had a bright future. In fact, the day that Makhia died, her teacher said she had emailed him her 5-year plan about her plans to go to college and ultimately open her own business.
That is heartbreaking to hear. Now, Maura, when something like this happens, the city that it happens in is thrust into the national spotlight. That's happening here with Columbus. What are city leaders saying about all this?
Right, and Columbus is another city that has had a lot of issues with police-involved shootings over the past several years. That's just adding to that national conversation that we've been having for the better part of the last year. Our colleague Josh Letterman was here yesterday, and he asked the mayor directly about what his message is to parents of color who are concerned about their children's safety. Take a listen.
To our parents of color, continue to hold us accountable. Continue to press on us for change and reform in the types of officers we recruit, how we train them, and how we hold them accountable. Because every child in this city and in cities across America, regardless of their color of their skin, deserve to be safe in their interactions with law enforcement.
Now, at the state level, Ohio Republican lawmakers have introduced a police reform bill. They're looking for adjusted training for officers as well as a use of force database. Savannah?
Laura, thank you so much.
The U.S. has now surpassed 32 million coronavirus cases. As the country passes that milestone, President Biden is marking one of his own 200 million vaccine doses within his first 100 days. The CDC says 34% of all U.S. adults are now fully vaccinated. More than half of Americans over 18 have received at least one dose. The focus now is vaccinating the other half. Public health officials are concerned that demand for the vaccine is slowing down. NBC News Now correspondent Isa Gutierrez joins us now. So, Isa, President Biden is calling on employers to do their part to try and speed up vaccinations. What exactly does he want them to do?
Good morning, Joe. So President Biden says that he wants employers to give their workers the opportunity to go and get vaccinated without being worried about taking time off from work. So this week, the president announced a tax credit that will reimburse small businesses so that they can give their workers paid time off to go and get their shots. Take a listen.
One concern I've heard from so many Americans is that they can't afford to take the time off to get vaccinated or lose a day's work because they are feeling slightly under the weather after a shot. No working American should lose a single dollar from their paycheck because they chose to fulfill their patriotic duty of getting vaccinated.
Now, the tax credit is just for businesses with fewer than 500 employees. It'll be funded by the COVID-19 relief bill that was passed last month, and it'll allow for up to $511 per day per employee. Joe?
Lisa, let's talk about one of the vaccines, Johnson & Johnson. The FDA released a scathing report finding multiple problems with the Baltimore plant that mixed up ingredients from the J&J and AstraZeneca vaccines last month. 15 million doses were ruined. So what did federal officials find inside that facility?
Sure, Joe. So before I get into it, I just want to remind our viewers, and I know we've said it before, but worth mentioning again, that none of these doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine were ever rolled out to Americans, to the rest, to the U.S. But yes, this report did find a series of issues at this Baltimore plant. Let's get right into it. So inspectors found peeling paint and unidentified black and brown residue on the floors, as well as failure to properly decontaminate waste that was generated during the manufacture of the vaccine drug substance. So they're citing, that the plant was not maintained in a clean and sanitary condition. They also cited in the report that Emergent BioSolutions failed to adequately train personnel. So those working on the manufacturing operations in quality control, sampling, and in other areas of the process. Again, this did not impact Johnson & Johnson vaccines that were distributed here in the U.S. The ones that were distributed came from, they were produced in the Netherlands. Of course, this did delay the distribution of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine here, which is still on pause. The CDC panel will be meeting tomorrow to decide whether, when, and how to lift that pause here.
And
Joe?
Isa, America is not alone fighting the virus right now. In fact, the World Health Organization says more COVID cases were reported worldwide in the past week than in any other week during the pandemic. India, the world's second most populous nation, is being hit especially hard right now, accounting for nearly a third of new cases worldwide. What's happening there?
Sure. So, Joe, this is the second wave of COVID-19 cases for India right now. And just yesterday alone, authorities in India said that there were 300,000 new coronavirus cases in the country. Meanwhile, we're also seeing that the healthcare system there is really struggling to keep up with this new wave. We've seen acute oxygen shortages at hospitals across the region. One hospital, even we saw images and videos coming out of there where the main oxygen tank actually stopped the flow of oxygen to dozens of critically ill patients. Also important to note that vaccine supply is short in India. Over the last couple of months, there have been a lot of public gatherings, both religious and political. The Prime Minister earlier this week telling people in a televised address to be careful, but some cities and states are already locking down their areas. Critics saying that these sort of mixed messages from their local governments and the Prime Minister are confusing to people and making things worse. Joe?
All right. Isa Gutierrez, thank you so much.
A new Axios Ipsos poll shows the pause on the Johnson & Johnson shot may not be having an impact on vaccine hesitancy as first feared. Right now, 20% say they won't get the vaccine, but that number has remained steady since January. Let's bring in Dr. Bob Lahita. He's the director of the Institute for Autoimmune and Rheumatic Diseases at St. Joseph Health. Dr. Bob, good to see you. I feel like you haven't been with us in a little bit. We missed you. Good morning. Now, we heard from much of the medical community, doctors like yourself who are friends of the show, who were worried that this small risk of blood clots did not outweigh the potential dent this could make in public confidence about getting any shot in general. But those numbers seem to show that that might not be the case. Did you expect that this J&J pause would have an impact on vaccine hesitancy? And how do you feel about that stat?
I think the stat's great. Number one, I felt that hesitancy was going to increase as a result of the J&J clot controversy. Even though it was exceedingly rare, I heard from many patients saying, see, I told you so, doctor. I don't want the vaccine. I'll wait 2 years to see how the numbers pan out, Savannah.
Wow. And so you've actually been hearing that. Do you think that depending on what happens with the CDC meeting tomorrow and these next steps for Johnson & Johnson and vaccine, will that help with people that you're actually seeing, patients, depending on what we hear?
Yes, I think it's ultimately going to help because we have taken great pains to explain the whole rarity of the blood clots with regard to both AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccine. But as you know, the J&J vaccine is available here or will be available here in the United States. And so, yes, we have to explain to those people who are on the fringe and may not get the vaccine because they're frightened. We have to tell them that there is no reason to be frightened. The vaccine is perfectly safe. And that's very, very important to transmit that information.
That is such an important message. Dr. Lahita, quickly before you go, I do want to ask you about the fact that COVID cases are rising in children. We know some vaccine trials are beginning on children as young as 6 months. What do you make of this rise, and when could we see kids get vaccinated?
No, it's very disconcerting. We want children to be vaccinated as soon as possible. There are 88,500 new cases last week, up 5% in children. Now, children rarely get severe symptoms, rarely die, but they do die. There are certain kids, for some reason, that get this infection very, very severely. And we want the 17, 18-year-olds in high school to get vaccinated. We understand there are high schools that are giving the vaccine, and with parental consent. It is extremely important to have that small population of the people of small age to get injected with the vaccine.
Dr. Lahita, with a lot of great vaccine information there, as always. So good to see you. Thank you so much.
Good to see you, Savannah. Thank you.
Let's take a look at what's making news around the world this morning.
NBC News correspondent Matt Bradley is with us today. Hi, Matt. Good morning.
Hey, good morning, guys. So I just want to start off. Today is World Earth Day, and that's a particularly big deal this year. There's a 40-nation virtual summit. You've already been hearing about this a little bit, hosted by President Joe Biden. He's going to try to assert U.S. leadership on the global climate crisis. Yesterday, European Union leaders inked their own deal ahead of that summit that will toughen greenhouse gas emissions by law, and it was actually quite a big accord. Now, moving over to Israel, Israel's ratcheting up its air war in Syria, fighting against Iran's expanding power there And this is according to Western intelligence officials. Now, this isn't new, but throughout the past year, Israeli warplanes have hit a wider range of targets in Syria, mostly Iranian targets, than the previous 5 years. So now, it might not look wild, but the sighting of a gray whale off the coast of Naples has been called exceptional by scientists because that species is from the northeastern Pacific Ocean. Hasn't been seen there in 10 years. Guys?
That's kind of cool. Yeah.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
And we're going to get a check now on your morning news now. Chilly weather.
Yes, Bill Cairns, what is going on?
I know, I warned you.
You did.
All right. So you guys have to watch this. This is video yesterday from a horrific crash in Wisconsin. I mean, look on your right. As this car is winding through, 18-wheeler was off the road.
Geez.
That's a snowplow that gets flipped over to the right there.
Goodness.
80 cars were involved in an accident on this stretch of highway in Wisconsin, Interstate 41. 6 people were brought to the hospital. Unfortunately, there was 1 fatality. It was obviously sped up, but pretty scary stuff.
Wow.
So let's get to the numbers. And we're done with most of our snow. There's a little bit in central New York right now, but the cold is the story. We have 89 million people right now that are impacted by a freeze warning, and everywhere in pink on the map from the mid-Atlantic, especially through the South and Midwest and also the Ohio Valley. So how chilly is it right now? It's pretty rare this time of year to have wind chills in the 30s in Atlanta. We're in the 20s in the Great Lakes, and look at the Northeast. Vermont, it feels like 19 degrees. So I hope you were able to find the hat, the gloves, and the winter coat. You didn't put it away too early. This should be it. Should. I got to find some wood to knock on. Temperatures this afternoon recovering nicely in the middle of the country, and then tomorrow we'll recover in the Northeast back up into the 50s and low 60s. Tomorrow, guys, we'll talk about a severe weather outbreak that is likely. That's going to be Friday into Saturday. We'll have more details coming up on that next hour.
All right, Bill. Thank you so much. That was a good mood despite the bad weather. So we'll see you next hour.
We're going to hold you to that promise.
Yeah, exactly. See you in a little bit.
Coming up, a critical look at President Biden's immigration policies as the end of his first 100 days approaches.
The 5 major promises that 46 has yet to make reality up next. A police officer in Norfolk, Virginia, was fired after donating money to the legal defense fund of Kyle Rittenhouse, the teenage homicide suspect who some conservative activists have rallied behind. Rittenhouse has been charged with shooting 2 men during protests against the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Norfolk police say Lieutenant William Kelly was fired after expressing support for Rittenhouse and making an anonymous donation to his legal defense fund, which read in part, "Keep your head up, you've done nothing wrong." In a statement released by the police department, the Norfolk city manager said in part that Kelly's, quote, egregious comments erode the trust between the Norfolk Police Department and those they are sworn to serve. NBC News has tried unsuccessfully to reach Kelly for comment.
Minneapolis and beyond, it's clear the story of George Floyd does not end with the conviction of his killer. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen spoke with activists who call the verdict a starting point for police reform and greater social justice nationwide.
Well, the guilty verdicts brought celebration, Minneapolis back to reality. How much of a turning point do you think this is?
I think that it's huge.
Nikema Levy-Armstrong is a civil rights attorney and activist who thinks what happened to George Floyd is changing policing.
Several jurisdictions have changed some of their policies, their practices. They're re-examining how they operate. They've shifted resources. That wouldn't have happened before May 25th.
She thinks the Justice Department investigation will help. Miami Police Chief Art Acevedo told us the Biden administration has to do more to lead the way.
Does this really change things with policing on the ground?
No, I don't think it changes things. It's going to take more than just the policing. It start with education, economic, public health, mental health, drug addiction, everything else, so we can eliminate the conflict.
John Thompson, activist turned lawmaker, says he's always thinking about his friend Philando Castile, killed by a police officer during a traffic stop in 2016. The officer cleared of second-degree manslaughter.
Some of you people saying George Floyd changed the world. You don't necessarily think so.
No, because they said the same thing about Philando. They said the same thing about Tamir Rice. They said the same thing about Ahmaud Arbery. Why do we have to die to change policing? too many sacrificial lambs have died.
Minneapolis already mourning another person killed by an officer.
And here in Brooklyn Center, protesters say they plan to gather once again in Wright's name. His funeral is planned for later today. Joe, Savannah?
While there's growing optimism for Congress to pass police reform in the name of George Floyd in the coming weeks, today the Senate is expected to vote on the COVID-19 hate crimes bill. This comes on the heels of a troubling uptick in anti-Asian attacks across the country. NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Leanne Caldwell joins us now with more. Leanne, good morning. So now remind us what's in this bill, what impact will it have, and what's the likelihood it will pass the Senate today?
Good morning, Savannah. So this is a very strong message sent from Congress condemning Asian American hate crimes, especially in this era of COVID. So what this legislation does is it directs the Department of Justice to review COVID-related hate crimes. It expands public reporting. It provides guidance on hate crime reporting and creates reporting in multiple languages, including Asian languages, so the victims can understand what to do. Now, this legislation is expected to pass the Senate today because there were many changes made to accommodate Republicans. So if this does pass, this will be a big bipartisan and rare bipartisan win submitted by the Senate today that will head to the president's desk.
Leanne, other news happening today over in the other chamber of Congress. The House is expected to vote on D.C. statehood. Now, President Biden has thrown his support behind this bill. So what are Democrats' arguments for making D.C. the 51st state? And if passed in the House, will Republicans in the Senate get on board to send it to the president's desk?
Well, Savannah, if the House and the president had their way, the license plates in D.C. would no longer say taxation without representation. This has been a big push from Democrats. President Biden is fully behind it. Let's listen to what House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says is important.
It is imperative that we correct this injustice, which is also a matter of civil rights and security. As last summer's protests in the January 6th insurrection made clear, D.C. must be empowered to protect its people.
The district does not have a lot of autonomy, can't call in the National Guard, pays taxes without representation, but its chances in the Senate are hardly zero, as Republicans do not want two more, what is expected to be Democratic senators in the Senate.
And Leanne, one more piece of business to talk about. The president's other big push, his $2 trillion infrastructure package. Now, Republicans are expected to unveil their counter proposal today, which is a lot cheaper, but includes a lot less. We also know there's a bipartisan push going on. What do these plans look like, and is there hope for bipartisan agreement somewhere here?
Everything's murky, and there's so much talking, and there's no clear path forward. This plan that the Republicans are going to release is about $600 billion, just a fraction of the $2 trillion Biden plan. A group of moderates and Republicans and Democrats say that they want to come to a middle point to perhaps make that the basis of any sort of legislation. Savannah, there's still lots of discussions, a lot of jockeying going on, but it's still very unclear what this final product is going to look like and if it's going to be bipartisan.
All right, Leanne, as usual, you had to say that quite a few times. It's unclear what's going to end up happening. Thank you so much.
From reuniting families to welcoming more refugees, when it comes to immigration, President Biden has made several promises that so far he has yet to keep. NBC News Justice correspondent Julia Ainsley joins us now with more. And Julia, you narrowed it down to 5 major immigration promises yet to be fulfilled as President Biden approaches 100 days in office. So tell us, what are they?
Well, it starts with reuniting those families separated under the Trump administration, also ending ICE detention for families. It also would mean raising that refugee cap, stopping border wall construction. Right now it's paused, but to actually permanently decree that it is stopped, and then also holding the Trump administration accountable for the family separation policy. These are all things that as a candidate or as president-elect, Biden said he would do. It's not necessarily that he's broken those promises, but at this point, they're promises that have been deferred or delayed.
Let's take a look at one of those promises. The White House now says the president will increase the refugee cap by May 15th, facing a lot of pressure from the left wing of the party. First, let's listen to what Press Secretary Jen Psaki had to say about that this week.
The cap is just a number. Most oftentimes throughout history, you don't reach the cap. The cap is just a number. We could set the cap at 100,000 or 1 million. It doesn't really. We're trying to send a message to the world that we want to welcome in refugees, and that's who we are as an administration. We've always been committed to the objective, and the goal of 125,000 by next fiscal year is really a question of how close we could get and what kind of down payment we could do this year.
So, Julia, break down the president's campaign promise for us and why the White House says achieving it will be such a challenge.
Well, as a candidate, President Biden said he wanted to, raise the refugee cap to 125,000. Then when they came in, they said, really, we need to do that for a full fiscal year. So we'll look at September when they have a full fiscal year under their belt that they can actually accomplish rather than coming in midway. So for this fiscal year, they looked at half of that. Then they said just last week that, you know what, they're not ready to raise it to that. But as you saw there, by May 15th, they do think that they may have a final increased number, but still not committing to what that might be. They say that it's a matter of processing, at least that's what Jen Psaki said, that it's hard to process those numbers when they really have to rebuild the system that was dismantled under the previous administration. But we've also seen White House officials say that it's because of what's happening at the border that the system is overwhelmed. But really, that argument doesn't hold a lot of water. And if you talk to immigration advocates and experts, they'll very quickly point to the fact that there are two totally separate agencies that handle refugees who are processed through the UN and the State Department overseas versus people who arrive at our border claiming asylum and are processed through DHS, and those children are cared for by Health and Human Services. So really, it's hard to say that one system should have an impact on the other. And so we're still waiting to see exactly where that number will fall. And in the meantime, you have refugees that are really impacted. These aren't people who are just waiting, carrying on with their lives. They're usually in refugee camps and sometimes have sold everything they have, thinking they may be resettled in the United States, only to be told it's not time.
Julia, we should note the president has kept some promises when it comes to immigration. What are those he's kept?
That's right. The biggest one would be ending the Remain in Mexico policy. He actually did that in a very orderly way. There were tens of thousands of immigrants who were waiting in Mexico because they had been told under the Trump administration they needed to wait there until their court date in the United States. There were essentially refugee camps just set up at our border along in northern Mexico towns where they were often targeted and kidnapped and held ransom and victims to attack. The Biden administration came in a very orderly way, started to pinpoint exactly who qualified, who had active cases, give them dates to show up, and start to systematically let them into the United States where they can wait here for their asylum dates rather than in those dangerous conditions in those camps. So that's been one way that they've been incredibly successful.
Julia Ainsley, as always, we appreciate your reporting on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, the White House is doubling down on its push to fight climate change.
President Biden's latest goal next. Here's one story this morning I wanted to make sure we had a chance to talk about. Ezra Furman, the indie folk rock singer-songwriter, has come out as a transgender woman. The 34-year-old musician also announced on her Instagram account that she's a mom. In a heartfelt message to her followers, Furman said, quote, "I'm very proud to be a trans woman and to have come to know it and be able to say it. This has not been an easy journey." She also said she's been a mom for more than 2 years and hopes by coming out, more people will see that being trans and a parent is possible. Furman ended the post by saying, "That's all for now. More music to come before long." But this is really great to see. She says a couple of years ago, she didn't see any examples of trans parents. Now she hopes to be that example, that role model for others, someone they can look up to and know that they're not alone.
Representation, so important. And what a tease there for new music in this new phase.
There you go.
Very cool. Thanks, Joe. This morning, we're continuing our week-long special series focused on the climate challenge. Today, Earth Day, President Joe Biden kicks off a virtual climate summit with 40 other world leaders. He'll pledge to cut U.S. emissions by at least half by 2030. NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba joins us now with more on this happening soon. Monica, good morning. Now, this will be the most ambitious emissions cutting goal the U.S. has set to date. though it will still likely face criticism that it's not enough by environmental activists. But what does that 50% number really mean, and will we hear how he plans to do this?
It's a great question, Savannah. The White House is expected to really unveil this at this climate summit later this morning, but they haven't given a specific roadmap or details for certain targets in the economic sectors of how they plan to meet this very ambitious and aggressive goal of really having these greenhouse gas emissions by more than 50% by the end of this decade. And just to put it into context a little bit, former President Barack Obama had committed to about 25 to 28% reduction by 2025. So this more than doubles that. And this is really an attempt by the White House and President Biden to show that they're coming onto the global stage, and they want to reassure partners and allies worldwide that they're committed to doing something about the climate crisis. And that's because of the previous administration and former President Trump pulling the U.S. out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, we saw President Biden in one of his very first acts rejoining it. So he's going to speak to the significance of that. And he also hopes that this can potentially create jobs. So expect him to tout his infrastructure bill as well as something that dovetails with this approach to climate. Savannah.
Monica, I want to ask you more about what you mentioned about this sort of positioning on the world stage, because leaders from around the world are attending this summit, including China, including Russia. The U.S. has had some contentious encounters as of late with those countries. So what does this event mean for establishing the U.S. as a global leader on climate issues, especially since, according to the UN, in order to reach their goals here on limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, this has to be a global thing to cut those emissions? Can we inspire other countries to commit to the same thing?
That's the hope, and that's the mission, and that's why the U.S. committed so early to holding this two-day summit. They wanted to take the lead on this and make this announcement in the hopes that then other countries would follow. There's a UN climate summit that's scheduled for November in Scotland, and by then they hope that many of these dozens of countries that are participating today make similar commitments to the one the U.S. is making today. But again, there's a lot of questions here about some posturing. The U.S., in fact, has been one to criticize other countries when they set these really high goals that don't seem attainable. So today is about trying to announce something that, in their view, doesn't just look good, but is actually doable for the future. Savannah.
Monica, also happening on this Earth Day, climate activist Greta Thunberg is planning to testify before a House panel. Reminder, she is a teenager who has been a lightning rod here on this topic. What's she expected to touch on?
Yeah, the 18-year-old Swedish climate activist is going to participate virtually in this House hearing on fossil fuel subsidies. And we can expect her to really push further than what we've heard so far from the U.S. commitment and others globally. She's going to encourage world leaders to do more. She doesn't believe that this 50% reduction in the next 9 years is actually enough. So expect her to call for even more action and to call out leaders who haven't done this. And again, the U.S. is in a precarious position here because many look around and say you can make a commitment now, but if it's not politically durable, meaning if the next president comes in and erases all of that gain and commitment, what is the point? And how do we come to a solution where people can actually commit to something that becomes reality despite who we elect into office? Savannah.
Monica, an important topic every day, but certainly a timely one on Earth Day. Thank you so much.
As part of our week-long series, The Climate Challenge, we have an exclusive report from Syria. NBC News chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel reports on the devastating environmental and health toll of a decade of war.
Northern Syria practically floats on oil. But instead of making the people rich, the oil is killing them. A decade of war has left oil facilities here in ruins and created an environmental catastrophe. Dozens of rivers and streams now run black. The water is lifeless and undrinkable. And these are the children's playgrounds. Abdi Abdullah, a village leader, says the land is poisoned. We do not want oil, he says. The people in northern Syria are close American allies, the Kurds. Their oil has long been their curse. When ISIS took over, the terrorists seized the oil facilities to fund their murderous caliphate. When President Trump finished driving ISIS out, he wanted the oil too.
We're keeping the oil. We have the oil. The oil is secure. We left troops behind only for the oil.
But the oil pumps were never really secured. Unmaintained, they spew day and night. Unregulated black market refineries pollute the air. Many children work the sites. Oncologist Dr. Danish Mohammed says lung, thyroid, and skin cancers are now rampant. Every day we see 4 or 5 new cases of cancer, just in my clinic, he says. I've spent years following the plight of the Syrian Kurds. They fought off ISIS with U.S. Special Forces. Now they're fighting what's beneath their feet and losing. U.S. troops continue to patrol here looking for ISIS holdouts, but there's still no stability. And the environmental fallout from the toxic mix of war and oil means millions of Syrian refugees will have a far less welcoming homeland to return to.
The U.S. military did not respond to our request for comment. There are currently no plans to clean up the oil contamination, and any cleanup because of the ongoing conflict would be extraordinarily difficult and expensive. And this is just a glimpse of the environmental degradation in Syria. Joe, Savannah.
Coming up, big-name corporate bankruptcies have been an unfortunate hallmark of this pandemic.
But how have they affected America's smaller businesses that may supply some of their goods? We'll take a look at that next.
Time for our CNBC Money Minute, the biggest financial headlines of the day and why they matter to you.
CNBC's Bertha Coombs is with us again today. Lucky for us. Hi, Bertha. Good morning.
Oh, how nice. Good morning, Joe and Savannah. So Credit Suisse, the big Swiss bank, is looking to raise more than $2 billion in new funds following big losses related to the collapse of a U.S. investment fund recently. The bank expects another hit of about $655 million this quarter from Archegos. Credit Suisse says if the nearly $5 billion charge due to Archegos and the collapse of a British finance firm Greensill had been stripped out, it would have reported its best quarterly profit in about a decade. Meantime, Samsung has launched a program to put some of the older Galaxy phone to new uses and keep them out of the landfill. Owners can take certain models from 2018 or later, can download an update to turn the device into a smart home sensor that can do things like detect the sound of a crying baby or turn on a lamp when it gets dark. Samsung says more devices will be supported in the future. And Spider-Man could soon join the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at least in terms of where it streams online. Disney and Sony Pictures announcing a multi-year deal giving Disney streaming rights for upcoming Sony movies after their initial run on Netflix. It also gives Disney access to Sony's movie library, which includes Spider-Man franchise, Jumanji, and Hotel Transylvania. Earlier this month, Sony and Netflix struck a deal giving Netflix the first crack at streaming Sony's new movies for at least an 18-month window.
I can't keep up with all this.
You don't really have to go to the movies anymore. I know. Just wait till it comes to home.
I know. I miss the movies, though.
I like the chairs that move.
Oh, those are so cool.
My favorite.
I like that too.
Really?
Sometimes it's scary. Some of them have
being on my couch, a little rosé, a cheese plate. I'm happy.
No, Bertha, there are theaters where you can get that too. Someone will bring it to you. It's fantastic.
Or you can just have someone at home rock your couch. Key moments.
All right, Bertha. Thank you. From iconic department stores to major restaurant chains, the coronavirus has driven many big-name companies to bankruptcy. And for every giant that went under, there are small businesses suffering as well. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Roll reports.
The pandemic wreaked havoc on major retailers.
We're now expecting a significant number of bankruptcies that potentially file between now and June or July.
Since March of last year, a slew of big-name brands have filed for bankruptcy.
Brooks Brothers has filed for bankruptcy protection.
Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J.Crew, GNC, and others as well.
Mall staples, customer favorites like Lord & Taylor, Pier 1 Imports, and Lucky Brands.
The pandemic has dramatically reduced foot traffic, and to the extent that you rely on brick and mortar sales, that's a recipe for a very difficult time.
Last year, 628 large companies filed for bankruptcy, the most since 2011. And just last month, 61 filed, nearly double the number from February. One of them is PaperSource, the stationery and gift store. It filed for bankruptcy with over $100 million in debt. Some of that money owed to small business owners like Lisa Mohar.
And what was your relationship like until March of this year?
When I first got an email, a purchase order with them, I was super thrilled. It was like a big goal of mine to be in there. So I was thrilled.
For 2 years, the Brooklyn-based illustrator supplied PaperSource with cards and gifts to sell in its 158 locations across the country. While 2020 was challenging, as it was for many people, this year started looking much better.
In 2021, they ordered a lot from me. I was very excited because it seemed like it was like turning over a new leaf, and I didn't really want to question it because I thought it was just a sign of good things coming. And then when we heard that they filed for bankruptcy, it was like they just pulled the rug out from under us.
She fulfilled the large order from PaperSource in late February. But now that it's in bankruptcy, she says the company hasn't paid her in full, even as stores remain open.
I shipped my product. They were supposed to pay me. They're not going to pay me, but they're going to be allowed to keep their doors open and sell my card in over 150 stores. It feels like they're selling stolen goods. I don't understand how this is legal.
Alex Gagne also thought a large order was a sign of PaperSource's recovery, not impending bankruptcy.
We thought it was something exciting and cool, and it turned out to be the complete opposite.
Her company, Chez Gagne, which sells cheeky cards, gifts, and paper goods, has been working with PaperSource for over 5 years.
They placed like an $8,000 order in January, and then to place a $11,000 order in February, again, is very unusual. We would see those numbers maybe in a 6-month period, not in a 2-month period.
Several suppliers, like Alex and Lisa, question why PaperSource placed these large orders, then filed for bankruptcy, leaving them out thousands of dollars. Winnie Park, the CEO of PaperSource, told NBC News these purchases were consistent with how PaperSource has always operated, where the retailer buys more at the start of the year to plan for upcoming holidays like Mother's Day. As these largely women-owned vendors try to get PaperSource to pay them the thousands of dollars they're owed, executives at the bankrupt company are requesting a combined total of $1 million in potential bonuses for themselves.
There is something uncomfortable in seeing executives being paid large sums while many of the suppliers are going unpaid.
Many of those suppliers operate on slim margins. A few $1,000s can make or break them. And with a national chain like PaperSource now in bankruptcy, it's possible they may only get a portion of what they're owed.
Bankruptcy doesn't have a social agenda. It doesn't have a public policy agenda in the sense that it's trying to distribute the pain in a way that is consistent with maybe some notions of fairness.
PaperSource says it started to pay back some of the vendors, at least partially, and hopes to pay everyone eventually in full.
But if we're not getting paid for what we've already supplied, who knows if we're even going to make it to that point.
They've made it through the pandemic, but still struggle with the ripple effects.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.